My name is Arthur Wells. I'm 81 years old, and I need to say this now, while I still have the clarity to get the words right. I have lived on this same plot of land, right here in the foothills of Washington's Cascade Mountains, for my entire life. It's a place that holds more secrets than soil. In the late summer of 1969, when the rest of the world was looking at the moon, I was looking into the eyes of something that shouldn't exist, and I saved its life. That's the impossible truth I've held inside me for 54 years. This morning, it came back. It brought its family to the edge of my property, and in a single, silent gesture, I finally understood what it has been trying to tell me all these years. It was never a thank you. It was a warning. And I know you might be thinking, I'm just an old man, lost in his memories, confusing a bear for a myth. But I'm going to tell you exactly what happened. From that first night to this very morning, and you will understand. You will understand why the silence in these woods now feels so heavy. I know this land. I don't mean I know the property lines or the tax assessment. I mean I know its breath, its moods. I can tell you the exact weight of the air, just before a snow, that dense, wet blanket that hushes everything. I know the sound a Douglas fir makes when it's stressed by a hard wind, a high, thin whisper, versus the hollow groan it makes when it's giving up to rot from the inside out. I can distinguish the frantic, scolding chatter of the Steller's jays that means a bobcat is slinking through the undergrowth from their usual territorial squabbles. This place is in my bones, a map written in my blood. My grandfather cleared this plot. My father was born in this house. So when I tell you I heard something that night that was not of this place, you have to believe me. It was a sound that broke all the rules I had spent a lifetime learning. It was a tear in the fabric of the world I knew. A world that was, at that point, already so full of grief, I thought it couldn't possibly hold any more. It was 1969. The summer of love was a world away, and the moon landing felt like a story from another planet, a flickering black and white ghost on our small television. My own world had shrunk to the size of this property a year earlier. My father, a logger his whole life, had been killed by a widowmaker heavy, dead branch that snapped free from a falling tree. It was a freak accident, they said. A risk of the job, but for me, it turned the forest I had always loved into a silent, watchful antagonist. Every whispering pine, every shadowy hollow seemed to mock me. I was 20 years old, suddenly and completely alone in a house that was too big, surrounded by woods that had stolen the only family I had left. The quiet was the worst part. A heavy, suffocating silence where his footsteps and his booming laugh used to be. My life had become a series of chores, a routine to keep the grief at bay. But the forest was always there, reminding me of what I'd lost. That's why I almost didn't go. Why my first instinct was to bar the door and pretend I'd heard nothing. It was a late June night, sticky and strange. A freak thunderstorm had torn through at dusk. A violent outburst of lightning and wind that had left the air feeling bruised and unsettled. The wind that followed wasn't a clean, scouring wind. It had a wet, heavy sound, as if it were dragging something through the trees. I was sitting on the porch, watching the last of the light drain from the sky, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and shattered pine needles. The old porch swing was groaning on its chains, a sound so familiar it was part of the silence. It was a night for staying inside, for turning up the radio to drown out the sorrowful noises of the recovering woods. A night to be small and quiet and safe. I had no business being a hero. The forest had already taken everything from me. I wasn't about to offer it myself. And then I heard it. It came from down by the creek, near the edge of my property. It started beneath the sound of the wind, beneath the steady, rhythmic dripping of water from the pine boughs and the groaning of the swing. It was a low, guttural moan. It wasn't the cry of a mountain lion, or the grunt of a bear, or the panicked sound of a deer. I knew all those sounds. This was different. This was a sound of pure, unadulterated misery. It wasn't an animal sound. It was a sound of suffering, so deep and resonant that I felt it vibrate right through the floorboards of the porch and up into the bones of my feet. It was a broken sound, The kind of noise a living thing makes when it has given up all hope. It rose and fell in a ragged, desperate rhythm, a sound that didn't belong in the natural order of things. It was the sound of something impossibly large, and in impossible pain, and it was close. The moan was unnerving, but it was the next sound that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. A heavy branch, a limb as thick as my thigh, snapped with a sound like a cannon shot. The crack echoed across the valley, a violent, final sound that was too loud, too forceful for any bear I'd ever encountered. A bear might break a sapling, it might crash through brush, but this was the sound of immense, desperate power. This was something else. That single, explosive noise cut through the night and told me two things. Whatever was out there was huge, and it was in serious trouble. A deep, primal part of me, the part that had been raised on my father's stories of the woods, knew that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. The forest keeps its own counsel, but that night it wasn't whispering, it was screaming. And the scream was coming from my land. My first thought, my sane thought, was to go inside, lock the door, and slide the bolt home. I was 20 years old and alone. There was no one to call, no neighbor within shouting distance. Whatever was making that sound was powerful enough to snap a tree limb in two. Every instinct for self-preservation, every lesson the last year had taught me about the unforgiving nature of these woods, told me to hide. To let the forest sort out its own violent affairs. It wasn't my fight. But then that moan came again, weaker this time, trailing off into a rattling gasp. It was the sound of a life being extinguished, slowly and painfully. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't sit in my father's house, in his chair, and listen to something die just a few hundred yards away. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was a foolish, youthful need to prove I wasn't as helpless as I felt. I don't know. I only know that I had to see. I had to know. I stood up, the legs of the chair scraping against the old wood of the porch. The sound seemed deafening in the sudden quiet. I went inside and grabbed my father's old railroad lantern from its hook by the door. The cold metal, a familiar weight in my hand. I filled it, my fingers surprisingly steady, and lit the wick. The flame cast dancing, distorted shadows across the room, making the familiar space seem alien. Then I went to the woodshed and took his axe. It felt heavier than I remembered. It was a tool for splitting wood, not for fighting monsters, but holding its worn, smooth handle gave me a sliver of courage I didn't actually possess. The axe in one hand, the swinging lantern in the other, I stepped off the porch and into the consuming darkness. The wet leaves and mud sucked at my boots. The light from the lantern was a pathetic little circle in a vast, breathing blackness. I was walking toward a sound that should have sent any sane person running in the opposite direction. The forest was a maze of downed branches and slick, mossy rocks. The air grew colder as I got closer to the creek. The smell of pine and wet dirt was now mixed with something else, something coppery and rank. The smell of blood. I followed the moans, which were weaker now, more like pained breaths. The lantern light swung wildly, revealing a world in Passissa splintered tree trunk. A puddle of dark water, a patch of ferns trampled flat. I moved slowly, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, every snap of a twig under my boots making me flinch. I kept the axe held high, a useless talisman against the unknown. Then my lantern beam fell upon it. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I could have ever imagined. And it was caught. Caught in an old, rusted bear trap, the kind with cruel serrated jaws that hadn't been legal in decades. A relic of a crueler time, forgotten in the woods, waiting. And now, it had found its victim. He was huge, easily 7, maybe 8 feet tall, even slumped in defeat. He was covered in long, dark, matted hair, caked with mud and blood. One of his legs was horribly mangled, trapped in the iron teeth of the trap, which was chained to a massive, half-buried log. He wasn't roaring or thrashing. He had exhausted himself doing that, a fact made clear by the shattered limb nearby. He was just watching me. As I stepped closer, the lantern light illuminating his face. He simply watched me with dark, intelligent, and profoundly weary eyes. His breath came in ragged, steaming clouds in the cold night air. There was no aggression in that gaze, only pain, and a terrifying, silent appraisal. In that moment, a pact was made without a single word. He was at my mercy, and we both knew it. I lowered the axe, he didn't flinch. He just held my gaze, and I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that I had to help him. I was his only chance. I set the lantern down on a rock, the steady light pushing back the shadows. He watched my every move. I could see the tension in his massive shoulders, the way his muscles bunched, ready for more pain. I told him, my voice a stupid, trembling whisper, that I was going to help. I ran back to the house, my mind racing. My father's tools. I grabbed a heavy crowbar, a can of oil, and a wrench from his old toolbox. When I returned, he hadn't moved. He was still watching me, his breathing shallow. The work was brutal. The trap's springs were rusted solid. I had to douse them in oil, jamming the crowbar into the mechanism, using every ounce of my strength to find some purchase. The metallic screech of the metal, the sickening groan of the rusted springs echoing in the dead quiet of the woods. It was the only sound besides our breathing. For what felt like hours, I fought with that iron monster, his dark eyes never leaving me. I wasn't just freeing an animal, I was making a choice, and with that choice, to keep this moment entirely to myself, I stepped out of my world and into his. If you're finding this story as unbelievable and captivating as it was for me to live it, please do us a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who you think needs to hear it. You'll want to stick around to the end, because the truth of what happened this morning changes everything. When the last metallic screech died, and the jaws of the trap finally snapped open, a profound silence fell over the clearing. It was more absolute than the quiet that had come before. He didn't flee. He didn't rush away into the darkness like a spooked deer. Instead, he rose, slowly, painfully, to his full, terrifying height. He stood there for a long moment, the lantern light catching the grey streaks in his dark, matted fur. He looked down at the broken trap, then at the crowbar and tools lying on the ground. Then he looked directly at me. His eyes, ancient and intelligent, held mine for what felt like an eternity. There was no menace, just a deep, unnerving stillness. A single, slow nod of his massive head, a gesture so human it sent a shiver down my spine. And then, with a heavy limp, he turned and dissolved into the impenetrable blackness of the trees. I was left alone, my heart hammering, the smell of blood and rusted iron thick in the air. The secret was mine now. The forest remembers everything, and I had just become a part of its memory. The next few days were a blur of paranoia. At first light, I went back to the creek with a shovel. The scene was worse in the daylight. The ground was torn up, the blood dark on the ferns. I buried the broken trap deep, so deep no one would ever stumble upon it again. I scattered pine needles and leaves over the disturbed earth, trying to erase what had happened, but it was impossible. The memory was seared into the very air. I spent the rest of the week on edge, my ears straining for any unnatural sound, but there was nothing. The woods had gone unnaturally quiet, a watchful, waiting silence that was far more unsettling than the pained moans had been. I felt eyes on me constantly, a weight on the back of my neck whenever I worked in the yard. I started talking to myself, questioning what I'd seen. The exhaustion, the grief. Perhaps I'd imagined it all. Perhaps it was just a bear, and my lonely, grieving mind had twisted it into something more. I almost managed to convince myself, but the silence from the woods felt too personal, too pointed. It felt like an absence. Exactly 1 week later, I found the first sign. I had forced myself back into my routine, and part of that was a walk down to the creek at dusk, just as my father used to do. As I approached the large, flat rock I had used as a workbench to free him, I saw something on its surface. It was a single, perfect riverstone, smooth and grey and shaped exactly like an egg. It was sitting dead center on the flat surface. It wasn't a rock that had rolled there by chance or been washed up by the water. The creek was a good 20 feet away. This stone had been placed. It was deliberate. It was an offering, a symbol. It was a message sent across the silent divide between two worlds. I stood there, staring at it as the light faded, the cool evening air raising goosebumps on my skin. I didn't touch it. I understood instinctively that this was not for me to take. This was the start of a conversation, and the first word had just been spoken. It was not a sound, but a stone. It was an acknowledgement of a debt. I left the stone where it was and walked back to the house, my mind racing. What do you give a creature that shouldn't exist? What is the proper etiquette for communicating with a myth? It was clear he was thanking me, or at least acknowledging what I had done. The stone was a gesture, and a gesture demanded a response. To ignore it would be to end the conversation before it had truly begun. An insult I couldn't bring myself to deliver. I thought about leaving a piece of meat, but that felt wrong, too primal, like an offering to a predator. This felt different. This felt like an exchange between equals, at least in this strange, new context. I went inside and looked around my small kitchen. My eyes landed on a bowl of apples on the table, picked from the old tree my grandfather had planted. It was a product of this land, but also a product of my care, my cultivation. It felt right. It was a piece of my world, offered in peace. The rule was forming in my mind, a simple, primal law. A gift for a gift. That evening, just as the last light was bleeding from the sky, I took a single, polished red apple down to the creek. The egg-shaped stone was still there, a silent sentinel on the rock. My hand trembled slightly as I placed the apple beside it. The gesture felt enormous, sacred almost. I was making a connection with something far outside the realm of human understanding, right here on the edge of my own property. I didn't linger. I placed the apple, gave one last look into the darkening wall of trees, and walked away. I felt those unseen eyes on me again, but this time the feeling wasn't threatening. It was watchful, curious. That night, I slept more soundly than I had in a year. The suffocating silence of the house felt less empty. It was as if I had a neighbor, a silent, solitary guardian, who was now aware of me, just as I was of him. The ritual, I realized, as I drifted off to sleep, had begun. I had answered the call. The next morning, I couldn't stop myself. I went to the creek as soon as the sun was up. The rock was empty. The apple was gone. The river stone, however, remained. There were no tracks in the soft earth around the rock, no discarded core, no sign of any disturbance at all. It was as if the apple had simply ceased to be. In that moment, the pact was sealed. It was real. I hadn't imagined it. A thrill, cold and sharp, ran through me. A feeling I hadn't experienced since I was a boy discovering a secret fort in the woods. It was a feeling of holding a secret knowledge that set me apart from the rest of the world. From that day on, the rock became a drop point, a silent post office between two worlds. A gift for a gift. That was the first and most important rule. An exchange had to be made, a balance maintained. The reciprocity was everything. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with anticipation. Over the next few months, more unspoken rules became clear. The creek was the boundary. It was a line drawn by nature that we both respected. I never once set foot on the other side. I could feel it, an invisible wall of trespass. That was his domain, a wilderness that did not belong to me, and to cross over would be a violation of the trust we were building. It would be like a stranger walking into my house uninvited. The forest keeps its own council, and his side of the creek was where that council was held. I was not invited to the meeting. All of our business was to be conducted at the rock, on my side of the line. It was a simple rule, but it was absolute. It kept the mystery intact, and it kept us both safe. It defined our relationship as one of respectful distance, of neighboring sovereigns with a clearly marked border. It was a geography of trust. He, in turn, never crossed the boundary either. He never came closer than the rock. The gifts would appear as if by magic, but he himself remained a ghost. Sometimes, in the dead of winter, I would see a set of immense, unidentifiable tracks in the snow, leading away from the creek. But they were always on the other side. On rare occasions, I would hear a distant, heavy footfall in the undergrowth, or catch a fleeting, musky scent on the wind, as I approached the rock, a sign that he had only just departed. He was a constant presence, a silent observer from the shadows, but he granted me the grace of his invisibility. He understood, I think, that a direct encounter would break the spell, that his sheer physical reality was too much for my world to bear. The pact depended on this distance. On the veil between us, we were two solitaries, coexisting on either side of an uncrossable line. The gifts I received began to change, to evolve into a language of their own. After the initial riverstone, there were other curated objects from the natural world. A piece of quartz crystal that caught the morning light in a dazzling display. A strangely twisted piece of driftwood, polished smooth by the water until it resembled a coiled snake. A bundle of pine boughs, the kind with the most fragrant needles, left there in the dead of winter, filling the cold air with the scent of life. For my part, I continued to leave things from my world. Apples in the autumn, a thick slice of bread and jam, a handful of carrots from my garden in the summer. It was a simple, quiet barter system, a conversation held in objects, each one a sentence, a question or a reply. I began to look forward to my morning walks to the creek with an almost boyish excitement. The ritual became the new rhythm of my life. Then came the first, truly strange gift, the one that showed me I was dealing with more than just a shy, intelligent animal. One morning I found a fan of crow feathers laid out on the rock. There were 7 of them, all from the wing, all a perfect, iridescent black. They weren't just a pile, they had been meticulously arranged in a perfect semicircle, their tips all pointing toward my house. It was deliberate, artistic even. It showed a mind capable of appreciating symmetry, of creating patterns. It was the first gift that felt like it had a deeper, symbolic meaning that I couldn't quite grasp. It wasn't just a found object, it was a creation. I stood looking at it for a long time, a sense of awe washing over me. This was not just a beast hiding in the woods. This was a person of a kind, a being with a sense of beauty, with a mind that thought in symbols. The mystery of him deepened tenfold that day. The next significant message was not one of beauty, but of power. For several nights, a pack of coyotes had grown bold, their yipping and howling coming closer and closer to the house. Their boldness made me uneasy. They were hungry and unafraid. I'd taken to firing a shot into the air before bed to scare them off, but they always returned. One morning, I went down to the creek, and the gift on the rock stopped me cold. It was one of the coyotes. It was laid out carefully, not torn or savaged as a bear would have left it. Its neck was broken, a clean, powerful, and instantaneous kill. There was no mistaking the message. It was a demonstration, and it was a warning to others. But it was also a promise to me. You are under my watch. You are protected. The forest, which I had once seen as my enemy, now had a guardian acting on my behalf. I had an ally in the ancient heart of the woods, and its power was absolute. This secret became the central pillar of my life, and also my greatest burden. How could I ever explain it? Telling someone would not only invite ridicule and disbelief, but it would also betray the trust I had so carefully built. It would be like revealing the location of a friend's hidden home. So I held it in, a glowing coal in the center of my chest. The secret isolated me from other people, but it also forged a bond with the land that was deeper than anything I had ever known. The grief for my father had made me feel like an outcast from the woods, a stranger in my own home. This pact brought me back into the fold. The forest was no longer a place of sorrow and antagonism. It was a confidant, a partner in a silent conversation. The daily ritual of the exchange became the anchor of my solitary existence, a purpose that got me out of bed each morning, a reason to walk the land with attention and respect. Years began to pass, the seasons turning in their reliable cycle. The ritual became as natural as breathing. Apples and pears from my orchard in the fall. In the spring, I'd leave a jar of honey from my hives. In the summer, fresh vegetables from my garden. I learned his tastes. In a way, he seemed to favor sweet things, but would also take potatoes or squash. The gifts he left in return became more and more specific, more attuned to my own life, proving he was a constant, silent observer. One winter, I was laid up for a week with a terrible cough, the kind that rattles your bones. I couldn't make it to the creek. When I was finally well enough to go, I found a bundle of osha root on the rock. A powerful medicinal herb my father had taught me to identify for respiratory ailments. He had known I was sick, and he had left me medicine. The pact was more than an exchange. It was an act of care. It was then I understood the full truth. He was not just an animal I was trading with. He was a witness to my life. He saw me come and go each day. He knew my routines, the sound of my axe splitting wood, the hum of my voice as I worked in the garden. He was aware of me in a way no human was. He had watched me grow from a grief-stricken young man into a middle-aged one, his silent presence a constant backdrop to my solitary life. The pact we shared was not just about the objects we left on the rock. It was a trade of awareness, a mutual acknowledgement of existence. The silence between us was not empty. It was filled with 54 years of unspoken meaning. The rock by the creek, once just a feature of the landscape, had become a sacred place, the most important place in my world. It was the altar of our long, quiet friendship and the foundation for the terrible warning that was to come. The 80s brought the first real test, a trial by fire. That summer was a tinderbox. The air was thin and brittle, and for weeks the sky to the east had a sickly yellow haze. The smell of distant smoke was a constant acrid temps on the back of my tongue. Every newscast was about containment lines and evacuation warnings. I spent my days clearing brush around the house, my nights sleeping poorly, listening to the wind, praying it wouldn't shift. One afternoon, the smoke thickened alarmingly. The air turned orange, and ash began to fall like a soft grey snow. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. I was about to pack what little I could into my old truck when a sound from the woods cut through my fear. It was the sharp crack of snapping wood, again and again, coming from the ridge behind my property. Not the random noise of a fire, but a clear, rhythmic pattern. A heavy, deliberate snapping. Drawn by a desperate curiosity, I followed the sound, and what I found made me stop dead in my tracks. My heart a hammer in my chest. It was a path. A clear, deliberate line of freshly snapped saplings, each one broken at waist height and bent to point in a specific direction. The breaks were fresh, the white wood exposed and raw. It wasn't a trail of destruction, it was a trail of instruction. It led away from the fire, cutting across the slope of the hill. I followed it, my initial panic replaced by a growing sense of awe. The path of broken branches led me directly to a long-forgotten firebreak, a wide scar on the land carved out by loggers decades ago, now overgrown but still viable. It was a route to safety I had completely forgotten existed. He hadn't just warned me, he had provided a map. He had used his immense strength not for violence, but to communicate a complex idea across a species divide, using the language of the forest itself. He had saved my home, and possibly my life. That night, as the wind shifted and drove the fire away up the far valley, I left a whole sack of apples on the rock. It felt hopelessly inadequate. The 90s brought a different kind of threat, one that was closer and more personal. A new neighbor bought the plot a half-mile down the road, a fellow from the city who fancied himself a weekend hunter. He was loud, his truck was loud, and his 2 hunting dogs were the loudest of all. He let them run loose, and their incessant, frantic barking began to shatter the peace of my woods. They crossed my property line constantly, chasing squirrels, deer. Anything that moved, I worried about them disturbing the delicate balance at the creek. I worried about them getting too close, about what might happen if they cornered him. I tried speaking to the man once, politely, but he just laughed it off. "They're just dogs being dogs, old-timer," he'd said. I felt a helpless anger, a frustration at this casual invasion. The woods were my sanctuary, and this man's carelessness felt like a desecration. I feared for the secret I was keeping, a secret that was becoming more fragile with every passing day of barking. My worry came to a head one morning. I went to the creek, my mind troubled, and found the most chilling gift I had ever received. There, sitting side by side in the dead center of the rock, were 2 leather dog collars. They were unbuckled, laid out perfectly straight, the metal name tags glinting in the morning sun. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle. It was a message of terrifying precision and restraint. He could have easily killed the dogs, could have torn them to pieces for their trespass. Instead, he had somehow removed their collars and presented them to me as evidence. It was a warning, but not a threat of violence. It was a piece of irrefutable proof, a demand for me to handle the problem in my world. Later that day, I walked down the road and handed the collars to my neighbor. I didn't have to say a word. The color drained from his face as he took them from my hand. He knew, without me explaining, what a close call his dogs had. I never heard them on my land again. The balance was restored. Our connection wasn't always about crisis and protection. There were moments of quiet, inexplicable communion. I'd taken to humming old tunes my father used to sing while I worked in the garden, simple folk melodies that hung in the quiet air. One still afternoon, as I was weeding the carrots, I finished a line of a song and paused. From across the creek, from deep within the shadowed woods, I heard a sound. It was a low, resonant hum. A single, sustained note that perfectly matched the last note I had hummed. It wasn't a mimicry. It didn't have the melody. It was just the tone, held for a few seconds, a bass harmony to my tenor. I froze, dirt on my hands, the sun warm on my back. I hummed the note again, softly. A moment later, the response came back, a deep vibration that seemed to be the voice of the forest itself. We went back and forth a few times. A call and response that had no meaning and yet meant everything. He was listening, not just to the sounds of the woods, but to me, decades past. I grew older, my body starting to keep a tally of the years in aches and stiffness. I married a wonderful woman, Sarah, who loved this land but never knew its deepest secret. For those years, the pact was a quiet undercurrent to a life filled with shared love and companionship. The exchanges continued, a secret rhythm known only to me. After she passed, 10 years ago, the silence in the house returned, heavier and more profound than it had been in my youth. The loneliness was a physical weight. The ritual at the creek became more important than ever. It was my only consistent conversation, a link to something enduring in a world where everything else seemed to fall away. But the world outside my property line was not standing still. It was creeping closer, its noise and its curiosity, a slowly rising tide that threatened to swamp my small island of solitude and secrecy. The modern world was coming, and it had no respect for unspoken rules or invisible boundaries. Then they arrived, the new people. They built a house a mile down the road. A monstrous thing of glass and steel that looked like a shard of a city had fallen into the woods. It was an affront to the landscape, a sterile box that refused to blend in. And with them came their noise. It wasn't the sound of a chainsaw or a hunting dog. Sounds, I understood. It was the relentless thumping bass of music that pulsed through the trees at all hours. It was the high-pitched whine of their ATVs tearing up old logging trails, a sound like angry, oversized hornets. The quiet conversations of the woods, the bird calls, the wind in the pines, the rustle of unseen things were drowned out by this new, aggressive soundtrack. The silence, the sacred medium of my long conversation, was being polluted. I felt a growing sense of dread, a feeling that my carefully guarded world was shrinking, its borders being eroded by a tide of careless modernity that I was powerless to stop. The real violation came in the form of a machine, a drone. It was a small four-rotor device that buzzed over the canopy like a mechanical insect. At first, it was just an annoyance, a strange new bird in the sky. I'd see it hovering over the valley, a black speck against the clouds, and feel a surge of resentment. But one afternoon, my resentment turned to cold panic. I was watching from my porch when I saw it fly directly over my property. It didn't stop. It kept going, crossing the creek, crossing the invisible boundary that had been held sacred for 50 years. It was hovering directly over the deep, secluded valley where I knew he lived. Its camera eye seeing what no human was ever meant to see. It was an intolerable trespass, a violation of the pact. I felt a surge of protective fury so intense it made my hands tremble. Some things are not for our eyes. I was the guardian of that boundary, and this mechanical spy had just flown right over it. I couldn't just stand there and watch. To do nothing would be a betrayal of half a century of trust. It would be letting my world, the human world, violate his with impunity. My mind raced, searching for a solution. I couldn't shoot it down with a rifle. The sound would bring the owners running, and the questions would be impossible to answer. I needed something quiet, something deniable. My eyes fell on the old shed, and I remembered my father's old slingshot. It was a simple thing, a forked branch of yew with strips of old rubber. I ran to the shed, my heart pounding. I found it hanging on a nail, coated in dust. Beside it was a small leather pouch of smooth marble-sized river stones he used for practice. It was old technology against new, a desperate, primitive solution to a modern problem. I grabbed it, selected a stone, and ran back outside, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The drone was still there, a malevolent black dot hanging in the air over his home. I am not a young man, and my hands are not as steady as they once were. But in that moment, adrenaline gave me a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I stood in my backyard, hidden by the eaves of the house, and took aim. The rubber straps groaned as I pulled them back. I led the target just a little, the way my father had taught me, accounting for the wind I could feel on my cheek. I let the stone fly. For a heart-stopping second, I thought I had missed. The stone was invisible against the sky. Then I heard it. Not a loud crash, but a distinct, plastic asterisk thwack, asterisk, immediately followed by the high-pitched whine of the rotors, turning into a tortured screech. The drone wobbled, one of its lights blinking frantically. It tilted, spun, and then dropped from the sky, disappearing